Irimajerti Hirna, the Anal-Nife Carfoon, Conchina Studio in Arganivara, agus Nyarta Grosta, Avranuaran, Conida Horch Concretia, Onuscarwecha, a Hasofar Arnilivrihar, agus Arniligania Fasta, agus Gertreat, a Creek Noferia, Three Crease Argirna. Direct we beseech thee, O Lord, our actions by thy holy inspirations, and carry them on by thy gracious assistance, that every word and work of ours may always begin from thee and by thee, be happily ended through Christ our Lord. Amen. Just before we go to the Chief Whip, can we check that all the phones are on silent, please? Thank you. I understand the Chief Whip has a proposal to make.
Thank you, Laskin Corla. It's proposed that the arrangements for the week's business, as set out in the revised report of the Business Committee, be agreed to.
Is that agreed?
Agreed.
Agreed. Now, we
I greatly welcome the apology that's going to take place today. It's very welcome. It's grossly overdue.
Deputy McNamara.
No, it's on the order of business, but we also need to deal with apologies for what is happening now. In particular, what's happening at UHL.
Deputy, the order of business has been agreed. We now proceed to statements of acknowledgement and apology to the families and to the victims of the Stardust tragedy. And before calling on the Taoiseach, and on behalf of all of us, I want to acknowledge the presence here today of the families of the 48 victims of the Stardust fire. They're in the public gallery and they're in the Distinguished Visitors Gallery. Today's proceedings mark at its mildest an important milestone in their campaign on behalf of their loved ones. I just want to say, Céad Míle Fáilte Roimh Galéir is intach. Thank you. I now call on the Taoiseach.
Laskin Corla, I want to join with you and beginning today by welcoming to the House the Stardust families who are gathered here with us in the Chamber and in the gallery of Dail. I know there have been many, many times when you thought this day would never come, over far too many years. I know that you were forced to endure a living nightmare which began when your loved ones were so cruelly snatched from you in a devastating fire. Their unfinished stories became your story, the defining story of your lives and the lives of your parents and other family members who left this life before ever seeing justice. I am deeply sorry that you were made to fight for so long that they went to their graves never knowing the truth. Today we say formally and without any equivocation, we are sorry. We failed you when you needed us the most. From the very beginning, we should have stood with you, but instead we forced you to stand against us. 48 young people lost their lives in the Stardust disaster. Many more were injured, and even more still had their lives broken and shattered forever. When I met with you in government buildings last Saturday, you reminded me of another time when 4 of your family members waited for days in the cold security hut, protesting your exclusion and hoping for access. I truly hope that the days since last Thursday have marked a turning point, and here today in Dáil, we finally begin to put things right. To bring you in from the cold and end the neglect of 43 years waiting and fighting for the only thing you ever wanted, the truth. Nothing else, no other agenda, just the truth. I hope this is a moment when the state, which rubbed salt in your terrible wounds, starts to help you heal. You asked me to try to really understand your experience, to really feel your pain, and to immerse myself in your world as you set out in your eloquent pen portraits to the inquest. There I found not only terrible anguish and unimaginable heartbreak, but also love, joy, laughter, personalities, promise, potential, slagging, messing, pride, dignity, talent, innocence, and the deep abyss of loss and loneliness. On February the 13th, 1981, 48 daughters and sons, husbands and wives, mothers and fathers, cousins and in-laws, uncles and aunts, neighbours, friends and co-workers went out to the Stardust on the night of the dancing competition and never came home. For their families, in the nightmare that was to follow, their loved ones not only lost their lives, they lost their identities. They were much, much more than numbers. They were bright, beautiful people. They had plans. They had dreams. They had their whole lives ahead of them. Today, as their families did in their pen portraits to the Stardust inquest, we remember each of them. Michael Barrett, who was working that night as an assistant DJ. He was wise beyond his years. He had an infectious laugh. He was 17 years old. Richard Bennett, who loved the horses and took on the role of breadwinner for his family, described as an angel in disguise. He was 17. Carol Bissett, a singer in the choir, a girl guide, quiet in her ways, much loved by all. She was 18. Jimmy Buckley, the life of every party, who loved hurling and had won a competition for his Elvis impression. Father figure, brother, hero. He was 23. Paula Byrne, always the peacemaker. She loved to draw, was the epitome of kindness. She was 19. Caroline Carey, a talented Irish dancer who took up disco dancing. A Dublin City Council clerical officer who'd recently found out she was going to be a mother. Her family asked me to tell this house today that this baby was the 49th victim of the Stardust tragedy. Caroline was 17. John Colgan, Johnny, always upbeat. He lit up every room and performed the Hucklebuck as his party piece. He was going to be an uncle. He was 21. Jacqueline Croker, a heart of gold who brought music into her family's lives on her red record player and used her wages to dress and treat her brothers and sisters. She was 18. Liam Dunn, training to be a butcher, which he loved, with a passion for music. He was a loving boy with many friends. He was 18. Michael Farrell, his family's bundle of joy. He worked at Cadbury, a dapper young man who always tried to look his best. He was a deep thinker, a diarist. He was 26. Michael French, Horsey, an auto electrician and the rock of his family, a role model who worked hard to share his wages and thought of everyone else before himself. He was 18. David Flood, a rocker at heart who loved the guitar and was known for his Jagger swagger. He never missed a day of work and he had all of life's possibilities ahead of him. He was 18. Thelma Fraser, gentle, kind, loved Friday nights and disco moves, remembered by her brothers and her sisters for her treats, her hugs, her kisses. She was 20. Josephine Glenn, quiet, gentle, always smiling and happy, a second mam to her brothers and sisters. She left school to help support her family. She was 16. Michael Griffiths, happy, outgoing, with a great work ethic and a generous nature. He loved family occasions. He loved Christmas and could always be heard laughing, singing, playing music. He was 18. Robert Hillock, Bobby, outgoing, hard-working. He loved football and boxing. He was very close to his late brother Bill. He was 20. Brian Hobbs, his sister was known as his Mammy Pat. He was academically inclined. He excelled at catering college, winning a gold medal for Ireland in competition. He was ambitious. He was going places. He was 21. Eugene, Hughie Hogan, a skilled carpenter, a sharp dresser with a beautiful voice who could hit the high notes, a loving, caring father. He was 24. Murta Kavanagh, caring, kind, good-natured. He was a heating insulator who looked after his father. He loved the Dubs and Man United. He was 27. Martina Keegan, not just a daughter and a sister, but a best friend and a confidant. She dreamed of being a model. She was studious and hard-working. She was 16. Mary Keegan, beautiful inside and out, shy at heart, but very fun-loving and sociable, a teacher to her younger siblings. She excelled at school and work. She was 19. Robert Kelly, nicknamed Spiky for his hairstyle. He worked on the B&I boats and loved it. He was a lover of music and embroidery. He was 17. Mary Kennedy, warm, caring, lively and fiercely protective, dancing as soon as she could walk. Her personality and her style were as bright as her smile. She was 17. Mary Kenny, popular, kind, funny, passionate about fashion and dancing, a fan of Leeds United. She'd just turned 19. Margaret Kiernan, a friend to all who loved sport and loved socialising, loved to sing Roxanne, and who dreamt of a happy future in a house next door to her best friend Deirdre. She was 18. Sandra Lawless, happy, kind, funny, selfless, a Girl Guide leader, a swimmer who won awards for life-saving. She loved hiking and camping in the Dublin mountains. She was 18. Francis Lawler, an army man with a love of style. He'd great leadership skills and he never liked to leave his beautiful baby Lisa. He was 25. Maureen Lawler, a loving and devoted mother to Lisa. Full of dreams for the future, she shared an interest in fashion with her husband Francis. Was always immaculately dressed. She was 26. Paula Lewis was her mother's right-hand woman and her father's pride and joy. She was a second mother to her siblings and her little sister's roommate. She was 19. Eamon Lockman, a protector of his brothers and sisters who remember the crossbars on his racer, a car enthusiast, a music lover with a deep laugh. He was 18. Donna Mahon, a lovely person who loved her job working in the newsagents, meeting people and being part of the community. She had plans to go to Santa Ponsa for her 18th birthday. She was 17. Helena Mangan, kind, caring, loving, brave, strong. Her daughter Samantha was the centre of her life. She loved to dance. She was 22. George McDermott, a gentle music lover with a cheeky grin. He loved a bop and playing cards with his pals. He was 18. Marcella McDermott, happy, singing and dancing with the most gentle and kind nature, especially with children. She was 16. William McDermott, Willie, a gentle giant with a beautiful smile, soft-voiced, witty, caring, kind. He loved the weekend, the Dubliners, and being on Hill 16. He was 22. Julie MacDonald, caring, helpful, thoughtful, a hard worker and provider. She loved football. She coached a local team. She was mad for Elvis. She was 20. Teresa MacDonald, the focal point of her family. She was brave. She stood up for what she believed in, and she loved all animals. She was 16. Gerard McGrath, independent and full of energy, talented with his hands, a dapper music lover. He had a passion for the natural world and a love of birds. He was 21. Caroline McHugh, an avid reader, Irish dancer, swimmer, a member of the local CB radio club who did well in school and work. She was 17. James Miller, a sailor who travelled the world, so happy to be engaged, to be married and ready to settle down and raise his family. He was 20. Susan Morgan, a tomboy who loved football and walks in Dublin. She was bubbly, she was funny, she was full of life. She was 19. David Morton, football mad and named Chesty for preferring to receive the ball there than have it mess up his hair. He was mischievous, he was charismatic, he was independent, and he had big dreams for the future. He was 19. Kathleen Muldoon, good-natured, thoughtful. She wanted to be a nurse and cared for all those around her. She was 19. George O'Connor, a gentle homebody with a creative spirit. He loved science fiction. He was attending his very first dance. He was 17. Brendan O'Mara, talented Irish dancer and sportsman. He'd help anyone out in any way he could and never had a hair out of place. He was 23. John Stout, sensitive, gentle, also an Elvis fan. He liked snooker. He planned to become a painter and decorator to contribute to the family household that he loved. He was 18. Margaret Thornton, a lover of fashion, music, skilled in dressmaking and tailoring. She loved the pictures, concerts, and especially discos. She was 19. Paul Wade, a people person, good at chatting. He made friends easily, someone you simply couldn't stay mad at. He was 17. Today, as Cian Corla, we think as well of the hundreds of people who were injured and who were scarred forever, physically and mentally, scarred by fire and scarred by survival. We think of the people working in the Stardust, the waiters, the waitresses, the doormen, the DJs. We think of the frontline workers who fought to save lives on the night, the fire crews, the ambulance and hospital staff, the Gardaí, the army, the taxi drivers. And I want to acknowledge those who came forward many years later and told their stories at the inquest. I want to acknowledge the Dublin communities who were good neighbours to the Stardust families and communities right across Ireland who supported them for 43 years. 43 years since the momentous, devastating loss that was experienced in those early hours of Valentine's Day, 1981. Families who had last seen their loved ones getting dressed up in their best, freshly pressed outfits, getting ready to meet friends, going out for a dance, suddenly hearing of a fire in the Stardust, or the sound of sirens, or the knock on the door. And then the escalating panic as the realisation dawned that a disaster was unfolding, to the desperation of searching, of hoping, of praying that your family member or friend had left, had escaped, somehow wasn't there when the fire started and spread, to the frantic grounds of the Stardust car park, the hospitals and the morgue, to the dismay of confirming the identity of lost loved ones by recognising melted jewellery, or an engagement ring, or a wedding ring, clothing, or a digital watch. With a loved one's name replaced by a number, or that dreaded label, unidentified, or waiting many years for confirmation of identity, long after the agonising pain of loss. And the dreadful aftermath, the body bags, the numbers, the rushed funerals, the closed coffins, the shattering of families, every subsequent event marred and scarred, tainted and tarnished. Their surviving children, whose rearing years were done through a sea of tears, mothers afraid to hug, afraid to love, in fear of losing another child. Broken hearts, broken lives, broken marriages. Being accused of telling lies, the smear of arson attached to their loved ones, having their grief and their sadness misconstrued as madness, a sense of threat and suppression when they simply started looking for answers. Stigma heaped upon sorrow bred shame and silence, the intergenerational and communal ripple effect of so much agony and the lack of closure. The families gathered here today and their loved ones who perished, the family members who are no longer with us, and all those who suffered horrific injuries were the victims of a mass tragedy. In such shattering circumstances, the most basic expectation must surely be that the state comes to the aid of its citizens and supports them in the terrible aftermath. Instead, it is to our great and eternal shame that, far from the warm embrace of a caring state, the Stardust families experienced a cold shoulder, a deaf ear, and 2 generations of struggle for truth and justice. Instead, it is to our great shame that state processes heaped misery upon tragedy for the Stardust families. I am so deeply sorry that your first bid for justice ended with suspicion being cast on those who had died or survived on that catastrophic night. With your pain and your grief compounded by stigma and rejection, families were forced to fight for decades to obtain the vindication that you won last Thursday, when the inquest returned a verdict of unlawful killing in the case of your 48 family members. For all of this, as Taoiseach, on behalf of this state, I apologise unreservedly to all the families of the Stardust victims and all the survivors for the hurt that was done to them and for the profoundly painful years of struggle for the truth. I apologise to the families that those present on the night of the fire were wrongly criminalised through the allegation of arson, which was an attack on their reputations. I say today clearly in Dail, every person there was innocent. I say today the truth is now known, and I say today not only were they innocent, they were unlawfully killed. The government accepts the findings of the coroner's court. The government accepts the recommendations of the jury. This was formally noted at our cabinet meeting this morning, and the Minister for Justice and other relevant ministers have been asked to report back on the implementation of its recommendations. I've asked my own department to prepare proposals to appropriately commemorate the disaster as requested by the families, and I look forward to engaging with and agreeing a way forward with the families on this. Last Saturday, when I met with you here in government buildings, I listened to the pain, the grief, and the righteous anger. It is beyond comprehension how, in the midst of horrific suffering, you found the endurance and the fortitude to form the Stardust Victims Committee and start your long, long fight. But that moment has led to this one. This moment where we say, your loved ones are no longer lost in the smoke and the dark and the fire, but are brought back into the light, where we fulfil the promise of the proclamation of our republic and say without question, they are our cherished children. I want to pay tribute to 3 of the women who sat in that cold hush outside government buildings 15 years ago who are here with us today: Gertrude Barrett, Antoinette Keegan and Bridget McDermott. Their incredible spirit in refusing to be kept out in the cold helped lead us to this moment today. However, very sadly, a 4th woman who was there, Christine Keegan, and her late husband John didn't live to see this day. I want to turn to the words of Christine and the questions that she asked, which was never answered in her lifetime. Christine said in a statement she prepared for the inquest, but that she never got to deliver: the Stardust fire took all our happy family days away from us. It took away all our belief in faith, and it took away our trust with successive governments over the years. We felt abandoned and all alone and left like lambs to a slaughter. Everything brushed under the carpet to keep the truth hidden. I would like to ask a question to the government, the establishment and its agencies. What did we families of the deceased victims of the Stardust fire ever do on the government to deserve this ill treatment and constant systemic abuse that we have sustained for the past 38 years. Today I want to answer that question. You did nothing wrong. The institutions of this state failed you. The institutions of this state let you down. These brave families should never have had to walk alone. We should have been by your side. We should have walked with you. We did not, and for that we are truly sorry. We should have offered counselling. We should have provided answers. We should have ensured that the truth came out. As Christy Moore recognised in his powerful song about the tragedy, the victims waited in vain, except it wasn't for 4 years. It was for 43. Today, we honour the 48 children who never came home. Today, we apologise to the families, to the survivors, to those who were denied the truth for too long. I want to thank the inquest jury for delivering a just verdict last Thursday. I want to thank the senior coroner, Dr. Myra Cullinan, for her sensitive and meticulous conduct of the inquest. The terrible reality is that we will never know for certain how many lives were ended by this tragedy. Beyond the 48 whose names we know, there were countless others whose lives were turned to ash on that terrible, terrible night. Their hopes and their dreams were destroyed twice over. First by the fire, and then by successive failures of this state to do what was right. And for that, I am truly sorry.
Antara Eamon Ryan.
Thank you, Lascan Corla. Thank you, Taoiseach. This is an incredible, important day for the families who lost loved ones in the Stardust fire. But I'm conscious that any sense of relief today's apology may bring is tempered by the fact that they had to wait for far, far too long to hear it. Most of us in this chamber know what it's like to lose a family member, but few of us will have experienced the devastation of losing a loved one in such terrible circumstances. The fact that this pain was compounded by the state's unwillingness to correct the glaring flaws of those original investigations for so long is impossible to justify by anyone here today. The organs of the Irish state didn't respond when repeatedly confronted by contradictory evidence. It's a sobering indictment of our integrity as a nation, and one that we must reflect upon, uncomfortable though it may be for many of us in most powerful positions. I've spent some time since the verdict was announced last week going back over the pen portraits of the victims that have been read out by their families during the inquest's opening weeks. Reading about so many young lives cut short just as they were entering their prime is incredibly poignant. No one who died in that fire was over the age of 27. In fact, the vast majority were in their late teens or early 20s. I was 17 when that fire took place, and I remember the shock that spread over Dublin, the pall, the gloom that Sunday, and then on Monday morning going to school trying to make sense of what had happened. The fondness and affection with which the families talk about those they lost is both touching and heartbreaking. Young people finding love or seeking adventure, boyfriends and girlfriends with dreams of settling down and raising families of their own, fans of football and fashion, some who might have loved the Rolling Stones, others Dolly Parton or Diana Ross. Young people generously sharing their pay with their parents to help their families through tough times. The portrait that Thelma Fraser's family gave the inquest would stay with you. And I hope and trust they won't mind me sharing some of it just as an example with you now, so as I think it illustrates the incredible sense of loss that all the families have experienced. Barbara Fraser was just 6 years old when she watched her big sister do her hair and makeup and pick up her clothes ahead of the Valentine's disco. Growing up in a house full of boys in Ringsend, the two sisters shared a bed in the family's box room, despite the 14-year-old age difference between them. Thelma had hugged her little sister Barbara that night, given her a kiss and tucked her into bed before she headed to Artane. The next morning, her father woke her frantically, shouting at her if she knew where Thelma was. That was the night, she said, they stole my sister, that stole my happy family, that stole my childhood. Barbara told the inquest. The big sister, who Barbara had idolised, wasn't there when she made her first Holy Communion a year later, nor at any of the other life events that form such important markers in a young person's life. In my teens for advice, as she said, my big sister should have been there. In my preparations for my wedding, my sister should have been there. When I had my daughter, my sister should have been there. Thelma's brother Morris recalled how the house went from being a happy home full of life and laughter to just a house. Everyone could and should, I'd urge, read the portraits themselves if they haven't already. Many of the families knew deep down that the official account of how their children had died wasn't right. The original tribunal had certainly given the impression of thoroughness, sitting for 122 days, hearing from more than 350 witnesses. But the conclusions it reached were clearly flawed. Despite unearthing no evidence to indicate that the fire was started deliberately, it nevertheless concluded that the most probable explanation was that it was the result of arson. We've witnessed this blaming of victims before, and I'm not the first to note the awful similarity to the Hillsborough Stadium disaster, where another devastated community was left to battle the authorities for decades in order to get justice. And just as with the Hillsborough campaign, the Stardust families were forced to call on every possible reserve of resilience and determination so as to force a disinterested state to listen. Just as with Hillsborough, the families eventually succeeded in getting an order for a new inquest to be held, with the Attorney General accepting their argument that the original inquest had been too narrowly focused on the medical cause of their loved ones' deaths and not enough on the wider circumstances behind them. Last week, the families got their answer, the answer that they had known for decades, but were continually denied by the state, that their loved ones had been unlawfully killed. The families have every right to be angry at the state which denied them that truth for so long. What further compounds the sense of tragedy is that it was so avoidable if only proper fire, health and safety rules had been followed. Now, we might be tempted to look back at the early 80s as an almost backward time compared to now, but rules and responsibilities around fire safety were well established. The Stardust nightclub was also known not to be following them. A Dublin Corporation planning official had identified that the wrong type of tile was being used on the nightclub's walls, but it felt it was up to the fire brigades to object and not his. Numerous complaints have been made by a corporation inspector about the venue's exits being blocked, and yet it continued to operate. Just 2 weeks before the fire, the corporation had complained to Patrick Butterley that exits had been blocked during a packed concert at the venue. Assurances were given, but not honoured. It's right that the Taoiseach has offered you, the relatives, a full state apology today. It is one you have waited far too long for. As W.B. Yeats famously wrote, that too long a sacrifice can make a stone of the heart. But the pen portraits that were so lovingly composed show that that is not the case for you. Your sacrifice has undoubtedly been for too long, but the love and affection you continue to hold in your hearts for the sons, daughters, mothers, fathers, brothers, sisters, aunts and uncles you have lost is undeniable. I'd like to conclude Last Concordia by quoting another of the pen portraits, this time but from Michael French, for Michael French, as recounted by his sister Caroline. She recalled how Michael would take his young siblings to St Anne's Park on the crossbar, the yellow racer he made himself, or danced around the kitchen with his mother when she needed cheering up. His dream, she said, was to make life a little easier for his mother. Michael was a legend. He was our big brother and our rock, she recalled. Young lives, cut short, but the cherished memories remained. You, their loved ones, have kept those memories alive. You are an example of all that is good in our country. Thank you.
Thank you, Minister Bogarai and Cara Dara O'Brien.
And I too join in the welcome to the families who are here today, and I wish to join the Taoiseach, the government, and I believe all of us who are privileged enough to sit in this House in issuing a full and unreserved state apology. And it is right and fitting for this chamber to offer, however late in the day, whatever solace we can. Like so many others, I remember that day. I was only 6 years old at the time, but I had 3 teenage sisters, and in North Dublin, the the Stardust was one of the main places to go. I can still remember not fully understanding at the time what happened, or indeed the scale of it, but knowing my parents were extremely quiet, my community were. Their worst nightmare had been visited upon 48 other families. In responding to the Stardust tragedy, our state did not live up to the principles of justice, its core values, nor on the decency that we owe every person. The victims, their families, their friends, and their community were let down. The failure, and this failure, is a matter of deep and lasting regret and shame for our state and all of us who represent it. The state response was utterly lacking in compassion and understanding. And even worse, it compounded the trauma with grievous mistakes, the baseless findings of probable arson that cast scurrilous aspersions of guilt on an entire community, the paucity and the complexity of the state compensation, the sheer amount of time it has taken us to get to today's apology, a process wrung out through gimlet eyes of a system blind to suffering. We owed all of you so much more. The depth of this tragedy is still so hard to fathom. Red flame and black smoke engulfing a heaving club, knocks on parents' doors in the dead of night, desperate phone calls, and the red-eyed visits to the city morgue at Store Street. It was a moment of despair that stretches across decades and stretches across the generations. A nation cast in gloom with shock, whole communities silenced and quietened for years. In the face of such horror, there were also stories of courage and compassion. The Dublin Fire Brigade personnel who made their way through the thicket of darkness and smoke, running into danger against every instinct except bravery. Gardaí who arrived at a scene of chaos and helped where they could, ultimately carrying the victims and survivors out of the ashes to worried and grieving families. Medical staff who fought desperately to save as many as they could, the trace of smoke heavy in the wards. Taxi drivers, neighbours, the community who helped the survivors. The religious communities who put the victims to rest in the days and weeks afterwards, offering what comfort they could across multiple funerals a day. The bravery, compassion and commitment of those men and women speaks to the best of us during the worst of our moments. For many, that night has never left them. They grappled with the bleak memories, bereft of support, other than the support of each other. The searing scale of the tragedy has not dimmed over time. The sundering of families, the unfinished lives, the incomplete stories, the paths closed forever can never be healed. The grief cut deep and it endures still. Its sharpness is felt and carried every single day. The families and friends gathered here today in the gallery and watching are a living tribute to those who passed. We can only but imagine the toll you have paid to keep their memories alive and to pursue justice over the decades without the support of this state. Added to that weight, and the family members who have passed in the years since, under a dark pall of injustice and grief. The matter never, ever settled for them. Questions were left open. The survivors have taken on their burden as well. We all risk being overwhelmed by the worst events in our lives, to be buried by the sheer scale of a tragedy. And it is a testament to the courage and to the convictions of the family and of all of the families that they refuse to be. Time and time again, they refuse to be knocked down by indifference and took up their cause anew. Your dignity and your grace is humbling, and I hope this moment offers some small measure of solace and vindication, a long-awaited measure of justice for you, for your families, for your friends, for your community. Today is not the end. There is a pressing moral demand for further steps now. The inquest recommendations on building standards and inspections need to be implemented, and they will be. They will be done so in full and in full consultation with the families, because this never can be allowed to happen again. A fitting memorial and engagement with the families, survivors, local schools and communities will be needed to ensure that night is always remembered by generations to come. And I want to commit to working with families directly to address what the next steps need to be taken. Justice demands not just words, but deeds. Your voice has to be the beating heart of that process. Today is a moment for the families whose lives have been changed and shattered forever. For the tightly knit, hard-working communities of North Dublin, where the streets went silent. For those touched by the terrible events, who were never the same again when they escaped the smoke and the flames. For those who never got out in the cold air of the early hours of February the 14th, 1981. Their names are in the record for time immemorial, and let us all remember them. A St. Valentine's weekend, brimful of excitement and possibility. Competition night in the Stardust. Pleading with parents for permission to go out. Blondie blasting on the radio as they jostle with brothers and sisters. Lipstick applied carefully and a new blade for every sharp shave. Black boot polish out, dancing shoes at the ready. Freshly pressed shirts and bright dresses. The usual row over borrowed clothes. A tie grabbed from the dad's wardrobe for the boys to get past the bouncers. A few bobs scraped together from the week folded into the wallet. A last glance in the mirror, and leaping down the stairs with a fleeting goodbye as the cold night opens to them. The whiff of perfume and aftershave caught in the air when the door shuts behind them. The full bloom of youth, futures stretched ahead to a bright horizon. They never came home, but they are vindicated now. Their families are vindicated. We failed them, and we are truly sorry.
Richard Bruton.
Thank you very much, Ashkan Corda. I think, as the three ministers have said, this has been a tragedy of harrowing proportions for the families. A Valentine's night that turned to anguish. You can only imagine the panic of people experiencing the chains and padlocks blocking their exit and the lights failing in the darkness as that tragedy ensued. I think the initial determination of arson was seen as a further slap in the face to the families and the victims themselves. The burning sense of injustice has fired these families throughout a very long struggle, and we who have represented them in the constituency have failed them, and I acknowledge that fully. Often it seems that the chains and the padlocks were being again put in place as they sought to find justice from a system that always seemed to have the doors closed. Your anger and frustration with politicians and with the system is amply justified. Even though the record of arson was overturned, you did not know the truth. And it is with great sorrow that we realise that at long last we've had to acknowledge the failings that have brought us to this day. I acknowledge the fortitude and the determination of the families, which is an example to us all, and I join wholeheartedly in the apology issued by the Taoiseach and the two ministers.
Thank you, Concorda. This is a very historic day, but it's also a very emotional one for the families of the victims and for the survivors of the Stardust tragedy. The fire in the Stardust nightclub in Artane in February 1981 was truly horrific. 48 young lives were lost and over 200 were injured. Since that night, the families have campaigned tirelessly to establish what exactly happened and to determine the cause of the fire, to get justice and the truth for their loved ones. As a teenager, I once attended the Stardust for a ballot session. Following my election to Dublin City Council in 1985 for Artane, I was happy to work with the Stardust Victims Committee, particularly with the late Christine Keegan, who was a wonderful woman. They actively pursued a number of issues, including various planning applications in respect of the Butterley Business Park and the provision of a Stardust Memorial Park in Bonnybrook. The history of the 43-year-long campaign to get justice and the truth is well documented, but I would like to focus a little on the 1982 Keene Tribunal report. While it did some good work in making recommendations to ensure that such a fire never happened again, a key demand of the Stardust Victims Committee, its finding that the cause of the fire was probably arson was incredibly insensitive and was very wrong. The Ireland of the early 80s was a very different place to what it is today. We had a hierarchical society. The Kerry Babies Tribunal is also evidence of this. But even by the standards of that time, the finding was appalling. For my own part, I genuinely believe that I consistently followed up any issues the committee asked me to do. I raised various matters in the Dail. I wrote to the relevant ministers as requested. But if I'm honest, though, this was not enough. I also admit that my relations with the committee were at times fraught, and I do regret that. I admit too that when Pat McCartan issued his finding in 2017 to the effect that no new inquiry was warranted, I could not see how the case could be advanced further. So the decision to seek new inquest was an inspired one. And I am in awe of the persistence of the families at that dark time to continue the fight. And they did so with determination and great dignity. But we can go into all these matters at another time. Today, the families have got the long overdue state apology. That the state failed them is clearly evident, and they have every right to be angry about what happened. In due course, attention can be given to other issues that now need to be attended to. Planning for a suitable state commemoration for all those who died should now be commenced in consultation with the families. Today, we remember in a very special way the 48 victims of the Stardust fire, and I hope that the state apology from the Taoiseach, which we've just heard, will bring some closure for the families and restore the identity and dignity of all those who perished in the terrible fire on St. Valentine's Day in 1981.
And I too welcome the state apology today, and it's necessary and very long overdue. Like TDs, I want to welcome all the families here today. I hope last week's verdict of unlawful killing gives some degree of comfort and vindication to the families for the terrible loss they've suffered. I hope the inquest has provided some solace about what happened the night of the families who endured and continue to endure enormous suffering. This suffering was compounded by the state's treatment of the victims and their families over the past 43 years. The Stardust fire, Valentine's Day 1981, was a national tragedy and left legacy of pain for families, the community and indeed the people of Dublin. As the youngest of a large family myself, I remember it being discussed as I grew up, but it was only when the inquest commenced that we really moved beyond the event and learned about the 48, or as the Taoiseach acknowledged, 49 young people that lost their lives that fatal night. As the Taoiseach also highlighted, the pen portraits aspect of the inquest was a very important step. It gave the bereaved families an opportunity to describe and celebrate the lives of their loved ones. While the conclusion of the inquiry and today's state apology will not bring back those lost, they are important steps on the road for justice for the 48 families, one they have been fighting for over 40 years. I welcome the Taoiseach's remarks earlier that the state must follow on through on the commitments and remaining steps. This must be done in consultation with the families. They must be at the centre of that process. I hope the verdict in today's state apology will bring some peace for the bereaved families and all those impacted by this terrible loss. And we recall and we pray for those who have passed away without witnessing today's momentous occasion, for those who have fought for the victims of this tragedy for so long. Gurmí Lamagah.
So my role in this was quite small, quite minor, but I would like to speak just to illustrate how hard the families worked on this. I was appointed Dublin spokesperson for my party in 2016. And as a Dublin spokesperson, I, along with the colleagues who had preceded me in that role, it fell to me to meet the families, which I did on a number of occasions, along with my party leader, Micheál Martin, at the time, who was leader of the opposition. I found it, I suppose I was sent in to bat and found that I had very little to bat with. Parliamentary questions, all the efforts made by both myself, by many members of the opposition, by predecessors who had held the position I held, seemed to be met with silence, and it became more and more frustrating meeting the families. So it was then with a great sense of surprise initially and shock, but huge delight, when I woke one morning to learn that the Attorney General at the time, Seamus Wolfe, who deserves huge commendation in this entire process, decided, against the backdrop of decades of denial, that an inquest ought to take place. And that inquest has taken place, and the verdict has been delivered, and the Taoiseach and the ministers have spoken very eloquently. I did try to place myself on the way into the Dáil today, into the shoes of the parents and grandparents and siblings of the victims, to try and see exactly what they may be feeling coming into Dáil Éireann today. And I hope they feel some enormous sense of vindication. Fatigue, I imagine, is one of the overriding feelings that they have experienced. But the one thing I suppose I have learned as a very minor political player at the time, and I offer my apologies to Antoinette, who I met several times, and other family members, is that behind every minister are officials. And officials very often provide the official answers that the minister delivers. And that is one of the most frustrating things that I found. But again, politics after 4 decades worked when an Attorney General of the country stood up and said, actually, it's way beyond time. An inquest ought to be held. An inquest will be held. Thanks, Last Call.
Sinn Féin, ich habe Mary Lou MacDonald.
Las Corla. For young Dubliners in the late 70s and early 80s, the Stardust Ballroom was the place to be. It was a huge venue that hosted cabarets, concerts and discos at the weekend. Such was its popularity that you could get a bus from the quays in the city centre directly to the nightclub in Artane. With 3 bars, a stage and a large dance floor, it was a wonderland for nighttime revellers. At capacity, it held close to 1,500 people. It was a goldmine. It hosted names such as Joe Dolan, Dickie Rock, Cliff Richard, the iconic Thin Lizzy, and even U2. So young people would flock there to sing and dance their hearts out, to forget the cares of the world and to have the crack with their friends. For a generation, the Stardust Ballroom was a place of excitement, fun, and the endless possibilities of a night out. On the 13th of February 1981, hundreds of young people headed to the Stardust for a Valentine's dance. And they would have done all of the things that young people do getting ready for a big night out. Blared the music in their bedrooms, picked out the clothes to look their best, got the hair just right, and made sure that they had enough money in their pockets so the night would be all that it could. It was a Friday night in Dublin, a Valentine's weekend. They were young and full of life, and the world was their oyster. And as they hurried out their front doors, you can imagine their casual farewells. See you in the morning. Don't be worrying. Yes, I have a key. Leave the light on so I let myself in later. Don't wait up. Love you, Ma. Love you, Dad. For 48 of these young people, this was the last time they would say goodbye to their mother, their father, and their family, and they didn't know it. These 48 young people, so full of life, so full of love, went out to enjoy a dance and they never came home. The Stardust was busy that night. A big attraction was the dance competition, which was won by Errol Buckley. His brother Jimmy, bursting with pride, jumped up on the stage to hug him when his name was announced. It was the last happy moment they'd have together. A little after 1:30 a.m, a fire was spotted in the west alcove of the ballroom. What initially appeared to be a manageable fire quickly escalated out of control. Staff tried to tackle the blaze with fire extinguishers, but to no avail. It spread at a terrifying pace throughout the club, fuelled by the PVC-coated polyester fabric on the seating and the highly flammable carpet tiles on the walls. Survivors recalled the inferno looking like a monster, a living thing coming after you with a frightening ferocity. As the heat rose and the fire spread, confusion reigned for people who had no time to grasp the horrifying scene that engulfed them. The fire melted material on the ceiling which dripped onto the crowd, and a huge cloud of thick, black, poisonous smoke enveloped everyone. People collapsed because they simply could not breathe. And then a massive bang. The lighting in the nightclub failed. Darkness, mass panic. People rushed towards the exit in a desperate bid to escape. The section of the crowd that rushed for the main exit were carried along in a crushing sea of desperation. Only one door of the main exit was open, the other had to be kicked open. Some people lost their footing as they reached for air and for escape. Antoinette Keegan, whose sisters Martina and Mary were killed in the fire, said, "I was on the ground. I couldn't get up with my sisters. We were all holding one another's hands. It was just like a fireball that came down and it was coming towards us. I remember putting my hands over my head. My last words I remember ever saying in there before I lost consciousness was, 'Oh God, help us.'" Those who tried to escape through the fire exits found them chained and padlocked shut. Windows were blocked with metal grills and steel plates, making escape impossible. Those who ran into the toilets remained trapped inside the nightclub, even as people outside tried to help them get out. They tried to remove the metal grills with sledgehammers and axes, but they would not budge. Firefighters, who first arrived at the scene at 1:49 a.m, tried to pull them down with the chain attached to a fire engine, but they would not budge. Many of those trapped inside ran back in the direction of the blaze and smothering black smoke. They couldn't find an escape route. Time ran out. In less than half an hour, the fire had ripped through the entire ballroom, and then the screams inside stopped. Silence. As Artane and the city of Dublin slept its way into Valentine's Day, innocence died with those young lives taken in the Stardust, with those young people so brutally injured in the Stardust. The news of the fire and fatalities had spread through the early morning. Families gathered at the local Garda station, desperately seeking information about their loved ones. They were told to get the bus to the hospital or the morgue. This callousness set the tone for the 43 years of disrespect and contempt these families would face. Families waited and waited for news, waited and waited for their loved ones to be identified. They waited in pain and agony for days. The families of 5 victims would have to wait until 2007 for their loved ones to be identified. Some families were handed a body bag with just a number tag. They were given no say on the graveyard in which their loved ones were buried, no say in the choice of undertaker, no support, no counselling. Traumatised families had to rely on each other for comfort and help. And as the families suffered this cruelty, the big lie was already in motion, spreading as fast as the fire itself. The big lie that the Stardust fire was caused by arson. The nation's newspapers' headlines screamed arson. It was a lie repeated over and over. It smeared, it criminalised the victims and survivors, suggesting that one of their number was responsible. It was a lie that devastated families and further traumatised survivors. And to this day, Lascown Corla, to this day, those families and survivors still ask, who crafted that lie? Who spun it? Who spread it? And why? What was their motive? And who were they protecting? 43 years on, and they still don't have the answer to those questions. In November 1981, the original tribunal, presided over by Justice Ronan Keane, concluded that the fire was probably caused by arson. The big lie then became the state's official position. One survivor described to me her experience of that tribunal as aggressive and hostile, how she was cross-examined by 8 different barristers, how she felt bullied and intimidated. She, Lascown Corla, was a traumatised survivor of the Stardust inferno, and she was 18 years old. The arson lie would remain on the public record for decades. And if the Keane Tribunal compounded the arson lie, well then the compensation scheme that followed compounded the state's utter contempt for the families. Families were forced to sign non-disclosure agreements. Families were threatened that they would lose their home and be cast into poverty if they sought an independent legal route. This is how the state behaved towards families who had suffered enormous loss and incalculable grief. The lives of victims' families were literally destroyed by the Stardust fire. Destroyed lives of mothers, fathers, brothers, sisters, friends, and a child. Gertrude Barrett, the mother of Michael Barrett, who was 17 when he was killed in the Stardust, I think powerfully summed up the impact on her family and others. Like a tornado, she said, the Stardust fire ripped through the core of our beings, wreaking havoc and utter devastation in its wake, leaving nothing untouched. Be it our home, our lives, our relationships, our education, our future, our outlook on life, in fact, our everything. Nothing was ever the same again and changed forever as we knew it. I had only 17.5 years of normality or regular family life. My youngest son had 10 years, my middle son had 14, and my daughter had 16 years. And no matter how long my children live, their lives as they knew it ended at ages 10, 14, and 16. The rest of their rearing years were done through a sea of tears, unimaginable grief, sadness, sorrow, and an untold amount of emotional pain. Others have spoken so bravely of family members falling into addiction, depression, illness and health complications because they simply could not cope with the weight of the grief and loss. And so many parents went to their graves without having the truth about the deaths of their child acknowledged. They died without the comfort of vindication. And yet, incredibly, the families kept going. The seeds of this extraordinary resilience were planted by John Keegan, who established the Stardust Victims Committee in 1985. John would die the following year. On the same day, he lost a Supreme Court case for personal injuries from the deaths of his daughters Mary and Martina in the Stardust. The ruling stood in sharp contrast to the more than £500,000 in legal compensation paid to the owner of the Stardust following the original tribunal. One law for the rich, another for ordinary people, a tale as old as time that still holds true today. For decades, the families and campaign pushed for a new inquiry and were obstructed by the state every step of the way. Instead of backing and delivering a new inquiry, governments continued to circle the wagons. In 2007, families were forced to withdraw from a government-established review of new information because the chair, John Gallagher SC, had represented Gardaí at the original tribunal. It is still mind-blowing that this would happen in the first place. In 2009, when the Coffey Review finally ruled that there was no evidence that the fire was caused by arson, still even then government refused to establish a new inquiry. Truth and justice swept under the carpet. In 2017, following a review of new evidence compiled by the families, Justice Pat McCartan failed to recommend a new inquiry. After 36 years of fighting for truth and justice, no new inquiry was again the response of the state to people it should have moved heaven and earth to vindicate. And yet, a year later, a chink of hope cut through the darkness. The families discovered new evidence with which to petition the Attorney General for a new inquest. In 2019, following a submission made on behalf of the families by Phoenix Law, the then Attorney General Seamus Wolfe announced that a new inquest would be held into the Stardust fire. The light at the end of a very dark, long tunnel grew brighter, but once again the contempt of the state towards the families came to the surface. After 43 years of struggle, the state had attempted to exclude elderly parents of victims from access to legal support and to that very inquest. Families had to fight to ensure that inquest jurors were selected in a transparent way and so that jurors would have their incomes protected. More obstruction, more disrespect, more contempt, behaviours, consistent behaviours that spanned more than 4 decades. At each and every turn, the state abused its power to bully, intimidate, pressure and coerce heartbroken mothers, grieving fathers and devastated families. Instead of the state standing shoulder to shoulder with the Stardust families, they lined up against them again and again and again. The state placed so little or no value on the lives of 48 working-class young people whose lives were snuffed out in the Stardust ballroom. To the powerful, these young people and their families didn't matter, and that's the cold, hard truth. This travesty happened on the watch of successive governments, successive Taoiseach and successive ministers for justice. The hope of government was that the families would eventually stop, eventually shut up, eventually give up, and eventually go away. Well, those governments forgot one very important thing. You don't mess with Dublin Mas. You don't mess with Dublin Dads. You don't mess with Irish mammies and daddies and families, not when they're fighting for justice for their children, because you will lose and they will win. Even if it takes them 43 long years, they will win. When they know they have right on their side, ordinary people keep going. And that's a lesson that those in power would do very well to remember. So today, finally, the state apologises for all of it, because the families of the Stardust victims didn't stop. They didn't shut up. They didn't give up. They didn't go away. They are here today in the public gallery of the Dail, and they are here in victory. And I want to say this to you. To the ordinary people of Ireland, your loved ones always mattered. The ordinary people of Ireland were always on your side, always had your backs, mourned with you, shed tears with you. They saw your suffering and they never abandoned you. They never forgot what you had lost. The late lamented and indomitable Charlie Bird told your story with passion and grace, and he supported you every step of the way. Our great national bard, Christy Moore, penned and sang your soft, beautiful anthem for justice. It called out the powerful and it named the crocodile tears. And They Never Came Home has rung out powerfully wherever people gather for a sing-song now, and it always will. The inspiration you provided for over 40 years and the solidarity of the people, that sense of community, that's the real Ireland, not the bitter contempt inflicted upon you by those who should have upheld your rights. Inniu Fuiera, Gawan an Stot a Leisce le Chowley Nanini a Moroi, Gnav Glahach Satina Stardust, agus Lo Siúd a Honig Slán. Fad 3 bliana is dahad, Curran Stot agus Realtas Inia Kayla Bakriv, Shiv Gakila or, a Grinna Shiv Kincha, Gerhonig on Irina Consulis. When the verdict came through last Thursday, it confirmed what the people of Ireland already knew. Unlawful killing. Unlawful killing 48 times. It wasn't arson. None of the young people who went to the Valentine's dance were responsible. Now the big lie that has cast a shadow over your lives since the 13th of February 1981 has been lifted once and for all. The Stardust fire robbed your families of a lifetime of happiness. It broke the heart of this city and took the breath of the nation. For 43 years, successive governments obstructed the revealing of truth. Justice was kept out of reach for those left to bear unimaginable loss. Birthdays, Christmases, christenings, weddings, more than 4 decades of family occasions with the trauma of that fire in Artane running through them. So this moment, this victory, this vindication is first and foremost for those unlawfully killed, for the survivors, for the courageous families who have lived for years with the pain of the lies, with the ghosts of unanswered questions, and with the sorrow of the empty chair. The Buddhists say 3 things cannot be long hidden: the sun, the moon, and the truth. For the 48 young people who never came home, finally the truth is revealed. For the survivors who have endured a lifetime of suffering, finally the truth has prevailed. And you, their families, brought the truth home for them. And now let justice flow like a river.
I have very vivid memories of the Stardust fire. I was living in Dail at the time, and my dad was working nights. So he'd come home from work and he'd go to bed. So we as kids would get up early and watch the television so my dad could have his sleep. I remember going down, I can't remember exactly what was on the TV that day, but I remember flicking through the stations and the news of the Stardust came up on the screen. I remember running upstairs to wake me dad to tell him about the fire. I remember the panic in his eyes as it dawned on him that that place would have been packed and that maybe some of his nieces or nephews would have been there. Last Count Carla, we had no house phone at the time, and the nearest phone was up the road from us. And when we got there, there was a queue of people, all distressed, who were all there for the same reason. They were trying to locate their loved ones and to make sure that they were okay. In the days that followed, we saw funeral after funeral, and a dark cloud hung over our community, a dark cloud that hung for far, far too long. The memories of that night will stick with our community forever. Generations of people will live with both the mental and the physical scars that have been caused not only by that fire, but by the treatment of people in our community by the state in the weeks, the months and the years that followed. We were told that the cause of the fire was probable arson, while none of the victims' families believed that to be the case. I can't overstate how insulting that initial finding was, not only to the victims and the survivors, but to our community as a whole. The trauma is still felt to this day. The trauma of the tragedy and the trauma from the way in which the families of the victims and the survivors were treated. From day one, in the eyes of this state, they didn't matter. Instead, it was abuse after abuse, insult after insult, dismissal after dismissal. But here is the truth. They did matter, and they do matter. As a TD for Dublin Bay North, I'm proud to look at the public gallery today and to be here with you while the state gives its long overdue apology. Those beautiful young people who had their whole lives ahead of them mattered. They had hopes, they had dreams, likes and dislikes, hobbies and interests, and all that was taken from them. They were dehumanised, and as their families said, they were bagged and tagged. Their beautiful loved ones reduced to numbers. The pen portraits at the Fresh inquest tried to undo some of that damage, and I commend Dr. Cullinan for facilitating the use of pen portraits. It enabled the families to rehumanise their loved ones, to share with the world everything they loved about them, and the world got to know the victims. Victims like Michael Barrett, who, in the words of his mother, had a great sense of humour and was always willing to lend a hand. Richard Bennett, a wise head on young shoulders who looked after his family and put bread on the table. Carol Bissett, who was academically gifted and had a real ear for music. Jimmy Buckley, an avid GAA fan who did a cracking impersonation of Elvis Presley and was caring and a loving brother. Paula Byrne, a people's person who cared greatly for her family and her friends. Caroline Carey, a talented singer and dancer. John Colgan, who his sister described as a charmer, always seeking to put a smile on people's faces. Jacqueline Croker, a Roach's Stores employee, a hard worker with family at heart, and who was loving and kind. Liam Dunn, a trainee butcher and a friend to many. Michael Farrell, a loving son who would have moved heaven and earth for his mother at the drop of a hat. Michael French, who was training to be an auto electrician and who could turn his hand to anything. David Flood, who talked about owning his own shoe shop and was handy with a guitar in hand. Thelma Fraser, a beautiful, wide smile and a gentle and kind soul. Josephine Glenn, described as kind and loving, who was happy to babysit for her neighbours because she loved kids. Michael Griffiths, a happy, outgoing man who loved his family, and they all looked up to him. Robert Killock, who grew up in Belfast, he came down to work in Dublin on the building sites after he left school. Brian Hobbs, the youngest of 7, a good worker who loved travelling and he loved making friends. Eugene Hogan, a beautiful singer who was due to move to Kerry with his wife and his 2 young daughters. Murta Kavanagh, who enjoyed cooking, fishing, music and worked as a heating insulator. Martina Keegan, described as a best friend to her sisters and someone they could always confide in. Mary Keegan, who idolised her siblings and who was described as beautiful inside and out. Robert Kelly, a lover of music who enjoyed his job working on the boats and was idolised by all who knew him. Mary Kenny, a loving big sister who was kind, who was funny, who was a great friend and who had a passion for dancing and fashion. Marie Kennedy, described by her younger sister as warm, caring, lively and protective. Mary Kiernan, lover of sports and socialising and a deeply caring person with many, many friends. Sandra Lawless, a generous sister who loved outdoor activities and outdoor life. Frances and Maureen Lawler, husband and wife, parents to Lisa, who was orphaned at 17 months. Paula Lewis, a fan of ABBA and the Bay City Rollers and the Osmonds, and was a loving big sister. Eamon Lockman, a protective big brother whose parents passed away, never seeing the truth or justice for Eamon. Donna Mahon, who worked in the local newsagents, but fitted nicely with her because she loved people. Helena Mangan, a mother who was kind, caring, loving, brave and strong. William McDermott, a protective big brother described as a gentle giant. George McDermott, a joker of the family, a gentle person with a cheeky grin that said he could be up to anything. Marcella McDermott, who spoiled her nephews and was a keen singer and dancer. Julie MacDonald, who did everything to please her mother and siblings, a hard worker that was fun-loving. Teresa MacDonald, who had a perspective for her living life and enjoying every moment of her short life. Gerard McGrath, who had a unique passion for wildlife and had extensive knowledge of garden birds. Caroline McHugh, a keen academic who had passion for the arts. James Miller, engaged to Marion, who travelled the world in the Merchant Navy by the age of 21 before settling back in Dublin. Susan Morgan, a lover of football, who'd moved from Derry to work in Nazareth House care home on the Malahide Road. Darren Morton, a big brother who was football mad and loved socialising with his friends. Kathleen Muldoon, a mature young woman who cared much for her parents, her brothers and her sisters. George O'Connor, quiet and reserved, adored by his younger siblings. Brendan O'Mara, he loved darts and football and was a brilliant Irish dancer. John Stout, a sensitive, gentle person who loved horses, snooker and Elvis. Mary Thornton loved music and concerts, going out with her family and her friends, and she'd plans to travel to Australia. Paul Wade, a twin, a loving brother, described as outgoing and the social focus of his family. Last Count Corla, I'd like to finish by using a quote from Louise Leach of the McDermott family. On the day of the verdict, she said, "We are taking you out of the flames, the darkness, the smoke of the Stardust, and we are bringing you back to the sunshine and the light and the music, and you are coming back to us."
There are 2 speakers left in this group.
Like others, I wish to commend the families of the Stardust fire for their long and courageous battle for justice in the face of opposition, denial and then negotiations, not just the cold shoulder. And that includes Marie Hogan, now Griffin, who did in fact move to Kerry and who gave crucial evidence at the inquest. The families achieved a stunning victory in establishing the inquest initially and then obtaining a finding of unlawful killing based on the facts presented. Families have been dignified, organised and articulate, and many would have given up after the delays, the challenges and the countless years that elapsed as parents and relatives passed away. The work of Dara Mackin and Phoenix Law deserves special recognition. We are fortunate enough to have courageous lawyers who can fight the corner of those who have been ignored by the state, failed by the state or challenged by the state. The Stardust will echo throughout Irish history and should be taught in Irish history. These were ordinary young people out for a night to enjoy themselves, and that it is every parent's nightmare does not do justice to the horror that was inflicted on that night. We can take solace in the courage and strength of ordinary people who fought back against injustice, and the families deserve the tributes, including those at recent football matches, proving that the family campaign enjoys the support of people who understand that this could have happened to them. While today is a day for the families and for the survivors of the Stardust fire, there are other cases where we have seen state failings for those who are seeking justice for the deceased, with inquests, with inquiries and apologies. For some time, fresh inquests have been requested by the families of the Whiddy Island disaster, whose victims died in atrocious circumstances in 1979. Family members feel that despite repeated requests, they have been ignored time and time again. There, the recorded causes of death for the victims did not reference the circumstances surrounding the fatal incident, including regulatory failures. During their tribunal, it was found that the tanker was in poor condition, with evidence of corrosion and leaking, and that Gulf Oil and the employees suppressed the truth about the events that occurred on the night. And to this day, 2 bodies that were recovered remain unidentified, and the state, according to the families, has never employed modern techniques to identify them and give solace to the families. I want to reference, as regards inquiries, the case of Shane O'Farrell, where even this House resolved that there should be an independent inquiry into the circumstances of his death. There, the failure to move on this continues, and the O'Farrell family, I know, draw inspiration and shared solidarity with the Stardust families and their need to do justice. Reference was made by Deputy Hoy to the Kerry Babies case, and in relation to the apologies there, which was given after 40 years. However, the apology was worded to make it unclear exactly what the state was apologising for, and there are still questions to be answered. And it has never been explained how 5 different statements were made in five of the same statements, which dovetailed, were made in 5 different rooms about an event that science said could not possibly be true. Finally, the family of Captain James Kelly is waiting for an apology for more than 50 years. Their attempts to secure an apology from governments have been met with obfuscation and an unwillingness to engage, similar to what happened to the families of the Stardust fire. The time is now for a full apology for Captain Kelly and for formal recognition that he was acting under orders. We need to see a sea change for those who are treated poorly by the state. People should not have to be in court or marching for justice where a wrong has been committed. That's self-evident, and it's high time that it's recognised.
Gordon Margaret, Last Count Corla. In 1981, I was head of Sinn Féin Youth. I think I've said this before in the House back in 2017. And I remember clearly the events of that time, issuing a statement, going into a phone box, putting the change in the phone box, ringing up the Irish press. All, you know, phone box don't exist anymore. The Irish press doesn't exist. But I remember clearly, I don't remember where I was when I heard the news of what had happened. Last week, I was privileged to go into the court, and I seen the pictures of the victims up on the wall. I suppose, like everyone else in the court, you were there, sort of. There had been so many false dawns in the past, and you didn't really know what was going to be the outcome. When they read out the names, they were like hammer blows, listening to the one after the other, and how they died. And then there was, then the judge read out the verdict, and it was like a relief for everyone in the room. And I'll never forget, I talked to journalists, they were crying, I was crying, the families were crying, the jury was crying, probably the judge was even crying. And it was cries of relief, but also sadness of all those wasted years that families had to go through. I could talk about, you know, there's not time to talk about the incidents, but I remember young people being arrested that night, Taoiseach. They were trying to break down the doors. With some of them had fire axes that they were getting off firemen. I think there was another young person that rammed a car into the wall, the toilet wall, to try and get people out. The doors were locked, they were chained, and they couldn't get out. They couldn't get out. And I remember listening on the radio, Sean Reinhardt, who I knew years ago, used to be the secretary to the group, and Sean was talking about that night, and he survived severe burns. But he talked about the gasp when the lights went out, and the screams then followed. And I suppose for anyone of that generation, those screams will probably live with us, and clearly will live with their families. I remember when I was speaking in here in 2017, and one of my constituents was saying that the thing they always talked about in their home was that no one was ever prosecuted. Nothing ever happened. The owners of the nightclub were rewarded, if that's the word. They were, I don't know what the word is, confiscated. Anyway, I've spoken too long, but I'm really happy for the families here today. I hope they find some solace in what they've heard from the Taoiseach. But I do think that, you know, others have mentioned other victims and other people who have, you know, we've apologised to belatedly. And I think we need to collectively look at how we treat victims and their families. It changed a generation. We'll never be the same. I'll never be able to go into a nightclub or a pub cellar without looking to see if there's chains on the doors. I've been abroad, and that's the first thing you look at. You're in somewhere strange, you'll always look to see that. I wasn't into Stardust, but I'm from that generation, and it's changed us, and it's changed us, hopefully, for the better. But we need to look at those regulations, why they weren't implemented. I heard in the court of the fireball that went up, fire regulations that weren't followed through. And again, as I say, some people that owned that nightclub was rewarded. And I suppose that's the big question that hangs over today. Why was no one prosecuted? Thank you.
On behalf of the Labour Party, on this momentous and poignant day for survivors and surviving families of the Stardust victims, I want to welcome all those in the visitors' gallery today. I want to express my deepest sympathies and condolences to you all, to your families, your friends, your communities, on the appalling loss you suffered 43 years ago. And I want to welcome the fact that at last we have seen a full and unreserved state apology offered by the Taoiseach this afternoon. That apology comes following last Thursday's historic verdict, a verdict in the state's longest-running inquest, a historic verdict of unlawful killing, which has been so significant for all affected. And the length of the inquest hearing, of course, pales in comparison to the long quest for truth and justice for the 48 who never came home. Evidence we heard during the inquest offers a tragic insight into the young lives lost that night, and the pen portraits were so powerful in bringing alive all of those children, because some were children, and young people. So many desperately moving stories which were told during the inquest, stories of devastated parents waiting to hear the news of children who were not coming home, husbands, wives, fiancés only able to identify their loved ones by their wedding rings. The jury heard heartbreaking personal stories. The story about Martina Keegan, who had brought a Valentine's Day card to the Stardust for her boyfriend David Morton. That card found the next morning outside the club in water. Others like Richard Bennett, who almost did not go into the Stardust on that awful night. He'd been turned away for not wearing a tie, but he managed to procure one from someone else. And so he was in the Stardust on Valentine's night in 1981, and he too lost his life. All those young people and children whose lives were so tragically lost, cut short when going out for a night with friends and family, something we all do, and 48 of them never made it home. It's been commented before by others like Charlie Bird that were the majority of victims that night from another area of Dublin, those awful deaths, the awful tragedy might have been treated differently by the government of the day. And indeed, the families, all of you, have suffered so much, not just the grief and trauma of the night itself, but the aftermath, the failure of the state to support and stand by families and communities. Injustices like the payment of compensation to the Butterley family that others have mentioned. And the failure of the state and the sense of injustice has compounded the awful grief and trauma suffered by all the families. Nobody should be denied justice or have to endure the hardship and the state failures that we've seen unfolding in the years following the disaster. And we know the number of victims far exceeds those 48 who so tragically died. So many others were injured, so many families bereaved and devastated, so many first responders traumatised, so many physical and mental scars and impacts felt by so many. Surviving families have spoken so movingly of the devastating effect the tragedy has had on their lives, and so many have had to grapple for so long with the decades-long campaign for justice and for answers. And I want to pay particular tribute to one campaigner for justice, one of the campaigners for justice, a wonderful woman whom I've been privileged to know for many years, who lives in my own constituency in Dublin Bay South, Betty Bissett, whose family are from Ringsend in Irishtown, and whose 18-year-old daughter, Carol Bissett, was one of those who died so tragically in the Stardust. Speaking to Kitty Holland, Betty has told of how that night, the night of the Stardust tragedy, marked the day when she and her family found themselves in someone else's nightmare. She's spoken of how she wasn't allowed to go to see Carol, who was in hospital for 3 days before she died. And Betty has spoken of her devastation because she wasn't there to hold her hand and tell her how I love her, she said. She said, I got Carol's coat back and a handful of her jewellery in a plastic bag. And that awful, awful indignity compounded the awful trauma suffered by the Bissett family and so many others. And I was in Betty's house. I was privileged to be there on Saturday with others, and to hear directly from her about her enormous relief that a formal apology would at last be given in the Dáil this week, and that was after they had met with the Taoiseach along with the others. I want to pay tribute to Betty, to her daughter Liz there beside her, and to all the other campaigners in the Stardust Victims and Relatives Committee, to incredible campaigners like Antoinette Keegan, like Gertrude Barrett and Bridget McDermott, for their courage in their grief. And I want to commend you all for your fortitude, the resilience you've shown over the last 4 decades. As we know, many champions of the campaign, like Christine and John Keegan, the late Christine and John, have sadly passed away. But I know so many of you, including Betty and Liz, have joined us in the gallery to watch today's proceedings, and we all hope you will have some comfort and some solace from today. But whatever consolation can be offered by this apology, and indeed by the important inquest verdict, this is more than 4 decades too late. And sadly, we know that over the years there was ample opportunity to address the awful suffering of survivors, and that active steps, indeed, were taken to evade accountability. The horrific deaths and injuries suffered at the Stardust were compounded by the disrespect and callous treatment of the families, and indeed by the flawed and deeply wrong conclusions of the Keane report. That cruel conclusion of arson, which cast such a dark shadow for far too long over the memories of 48 blameless young people and all the others there that night. And of course, we know that the later 2009 Coffey report, which at last rejected that arson finding, it was edited to remove a line accepting that a new inquiry is necessary if it is the only way of placing on the public record a finding that is based on evidence. But for a Freedom of Information request, it is likely that that important line in the report would never have come to light. And the effect of the deletion was that a full, robust and honest apology did not then issue in 2009 when it should have. And as others have said, we saw again a step back in 2017. As the saying goes, justice delayed is justice denied. And for all of you in the Stardust...
Get behind them with Sadiq Khan's all right, but Rishi's a packy. Get Rishi out.
Everyone!